There are places in England where history does not fade, it waits. And among them, one stands silent still, where music was once heard long after the fire had burned cold. St. Morwen's Abbey, nestled in the damp hollows of the Somerset moors, was never grand by the standards of Westminster or Canterbury, yet it possessed a gravity all its own, a gravity not of stone but of sound. Built in the late 12th century by Cistercian monks who sought solitude more than spectacle, the Abbey passed through centuries of quiet devotion until the dissolution scattered its brethren like ash on the wind. By the early Victorian era, it had long been a ruin. Its cloisters choked with ivy, its chapel open to the sky, its refectory home only to owls and the slow decay of time. Yet it was not abandonment that marked St. Morwen's in the public memory, but something far stranger, the reports, persistent and precise, of choral singing emanating from its crumbling nave on certain mist-laden evenings, singing without singers, hymns without breath. The first documented account came not from a superstitious peasant, but from a gentleman of considerable standing, Mr. Alistair Thorne, a retired naval officer and amateur antiquarian who purchased the adjacent manor in 1837. Thorne was a man of method and measure, fond of cataloguing lichens and charting bird migrations, and wholly disinclined toward the phantasmagorical. Yet in his private journals, now housed in the Bodleian, though long overlooked, he described with clinical restraint how on the night of November 12, 1841, while walking the perimeter wall with his spaniel at his heels, he heard the unmistakable harmonies of the Te Deum rising from the Abbey ruins. No lanterns flickered within, no figures moved among the arches. The dog, he noted, stood rigid, ears pricked, then whined and bolted for home. Thorne returned the following evening with a barometer, a chronometer, and a tuning fork. Again, the voices came, clear, resonant, layered in perfect polyphony. Yet when he stepped through the broken west door, the sound ceased as though snuffed by a hand. He wrote that the air inside felt denser than elsewhere, as if saturated with memory. Curiosity soon gave way to quiet obsession. Thorne began keeping nightly vigils, recording meteorological conditions alongside auditory phenomena. He discovered that the singing occurred only when the barometric pressure dropped below 29.8 inches, and a particular species of moss, Hypnum cupressiform, he identified, was damp to the touch. More unsettling still, the hymns were not random. They corresponded precisely to the liturgical calendar of the medieval Cistercian rite, as preserved in a tattered missal he unearthed in the manor's attic, bound in calf and stamped with the Abbey's seal. On the feast of St. Cecilia, the patroness of music, he heard a setting of cantate domino so intricate it defied the capabilities of any known village choir. On All Souls' Eve, a plainsong requiem drifted through the yew trees, each note hanging in the air like breath on glass. Thorne never claimed to hear spirits. He spoke instead of acoustic residues, of vibrations trapped in stone, of sound as a form of temporal sediment. Yet his handwriting grew increasingly cramped, his entries more elliptical. In one margin he scrawled, "The walls do not echo, they remember." After Thorne's sudden death in 1848, officially attributed to apoplexy, though the local physician noted an expression of profound terror frozen on his face, the manor passed to distant cousins who cared little for ruins or hymns. The reports ceased, or were at least unrecorded, until 1873, when Miss Eleanor Vane, a correspondent for the Quarterly Review of Antiquities, arrived under the pretense of documenting ecclesiastical architecture. In truth, she had read Thorne's journals in manuscript form and was drawn by the peculiar intersection of acoustics, liturgy, and what she delicately termed psychic topography. Miss Vane was a woman of sharp intellect and fragile health, prone to nervous fatigue, but possessed of a tenacity that belied her delicate frame. She installed herself in the manor's east wing, hired a local boy to fetch books from Bath, and spent weeks mapping the Abbey's remaining structures with a theodolite and chalk. Her breakthrough came not from measurement, but from silence. She discovered that if one stood precisely at the crossing of the transept where the altar once stood and remained utterly still for 17 minutes, a number she deduced from marginalia in Thorne's notes, the silence itself would begin to hum, not with sound, but with the absence of it, a negative resonance, as though the air were straining to recall a shape it had once held. It was during one such vigil that she found the ossuary, hidden beneath a collapsed section of vaulting, accessible only by crawling through a narrow fissure slick with condensation. Lay a small chamber lined with human bones, arranged not haphazardly but in concentric rings, each skull facing inward, jaws slightly agape. Among them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound codex. Its pages, though brittle, bore meticulous notation, not of music but of breath. Each staff represented inhalation and exhalation, each clef a vow of silence. The final entry, dated October 31st, 1538, the eve of the Abbey's official suppression, read, "We shall sing without voice, that the word may not perish. Let the stones keep what men forget." Miss Vane never published her findings. Her notes, recovered posthumously from a locked escritoire, reveal a mind unraveling not from fear but from awe. She wrote of hearing the choir not only at the Abbey, but in her dreams, in the creak of floorboards, in the sigh of wind through chimney flues. She became convinced that the monks, foreseeing dissolution, had performed a final rite, not of prayer, but of transference, binding their collective devotion into the very fabric of the place through controlled breath, harmonic alignment, and an act of will so total it bordered on the alchemical. Sound, she theorized, could be consecrated like bread or wine. Memory could be woven into mortar. In her last coherent entry, dated March 14, 1874, she mused, "Perhaps God does not dwell in temples made with hands, but in the spaces between notes, in the pause before the Amen." She was found 3 weeks later in the Abbey nave, seated upright against the east wall, eyes open, hands folded as if in prayer. No cause of death was determined. The codex vanished. The manor was shuttered, then sold, then fell into disrepair. Today, St. Morwen's is little more than a footnote in county histories, a picturesque ruin for walkers and watercolorists. Yet locals still speak in hushed tones of evenings when the mist clings low to the ground and a faint harmony rises from the stones, not loud, not mournful but steady, patient, as if waiting for someone to listen properly. And if one stands at the crossing on a still November night, just after dusk, one might not hear singing exactly, but rather the echo of an intention, a melody held in abeyance, a vow sustained across centuries, not by ghosts, but by the quiet insistence of stone that refuses to forget the shape of devotion. Sometimes in the deepest silence, the air itself seems to inhale and hold its breath. There are those who claim that sound, once uttered, never truly vanishes, that it merely recedes into the fabric of the world, waiting for the right conditions to return. At St. Morwen's, this notion ceased to be metaphor and became something far more intimate, a haunting not of spectres, but of resonance. In the decades following Miss Vane's death, the Abbey slipped further into obscurity, its grounds overgrown, its remaining arches softened by lichen and rain. Yet the phenomenon persisted, though rarely witnessed. A shepherd boy in 1889 reported hearing a Gregorian chant while sheltering from a storm beneath the collapsed chapter house. He described it as like wind through reeds, only with meaning. A botanist cataloguing rare ferns in 1897 noted in his field journal that the air near the cloister garth vibrated faintly at dusk, as if tuned to some unseen instrument. These accounts were dismissed as fancy or auditory illusion until Dr. Lionel Ashworth arrived in the spring of 1903. Ashworth was a lecturer in experimental acoustics at Cambridge, a man whose faith in empirical science bordered on the devotional. He had read fragments of Thorne's journals in a footnote of an obscure treatise on architectural harmonics, and, intrigued by the precise correlation between atmospheric pressure and reported phenomena, secured modest funding from the Royal Society to conduct a formal investigation. He brought with him not seances or spirit boards, but tuning forks, resonators, and a newly invented phonograph capable of capturing frequencies beyond human hearing. For 3 weeks he camped in the manor's stables, recording the ambient sounds of the ruins at hourly intervals. His initial findings were mundane: bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant lowing of cattle. But on the night of May 2nd, a date coinciding with the old feast of the invention of the Holy Cross, he captured something extraordinary: the phonograph cylinder, now preserved in the university archives under restricted access. Contains no voices, no melody in the conventional sense. Instead, it registers a series of sustained harmonic overtones, layered with such mathematical precision that Ashworth spent months attempting to replicate them in the laboratory. He discovered that the frequencies corresponded almost exactly to the natural resonant modes of the Abbey's surviving limestone blocks quarried from a vein known locally as singing stone for its peculiar acoustic properties. More astonishingly, when he overlaid multiple recordings taken on different liturgical dates, the resulting composite formed a complete, albeit silent, choral score, one that matched the Cistercian office for those very days. Ashworth concluded reluctantly that the structure itself functioned as a kind of lithic memory device. The monks' chants, repeated daily for centuries, had subtly altered the crystalline alignment of the stone, imprinting vibrational patterns that could be reactivated by specific environmental triggers: damp air, low pressure, the angle of moonlight on certain solstices. Yet even Ashworth, ever the rationalist, admitted in private correspondence that data could not account for the emotional weight of the experience. "One does not merely hear the sound," he wrote to a colleague. "One feels it as a presence, an attention almost, as though the place were listening back." His health declined rapidly after the expedition. Colleagues noted a marked aversion to silence, a habit of humming constantly under his breath. He died in 1907, reportedly clutching a fragment of Abbey mortar to his chest, whispering phrases in Latin no one recognized. The final thread in this tapestry of echoes emerged not from scholar or scientist, but from a chance discovery in 1921, during renovations to the village. Church built with stones salvaged from St. Morwen's after the dissolution, a workman found a hollowed cornerstone containing a small lead casket. Inside lay a single sheet of vellum, brittle but legible, bearing the seal of Prior Anselm, the Abbey's last superior. The document was not a prayer nor a curse, but a covenant. It detailed a ritual performed on the eve of suppression. The entire community, having taken a vow of perpetual silence, gathered in the nave and, through controlled breathing and harmonic intonation, offered their voices not to God above, but to the earth beneath, a final act of consecration meant to preserve the sanctity of their worship beyond the reach of kings and parliaments. They did not seek immortality, they sought continuity. Their hymns were not meant to be heard by men, but held by stone, until such time as devotion might again find a vessel. No one knows whether the ritual succeeded in any theological sense, but empirically, undeniably, something remains. Visitors today, if they walk the ruins alone at twilight, may notice how the wind seems to pause mid-gust, how shadows pool more deeply in the archways, how the silence grows thick, not empty, but expectant. And sometimes, just as the last light fades behind the door, a single note will rise from the foundations, pure, unwavering, neither mournful nor joyful, simply there, as if the stones themselves have remembered how to pray. It lingers for a breath, then dissolves into the mist. And in that moment one understands that the true horror is not that the dead sing, but that they never stopped. And that we, in our noise and haste, have simply forgotten how to listen. In the years that followed Ashworth's death, St. Morwen's receded once more into the quietude of rural legend, spoken of only in hushed tones by those who tended sheep on the moors or gathered herbs near the crumbling boundary wall. The Abbey, became less a place than a mood, a name invoked to still children's laughter at dusk or to explain the uncanny stillness that sometimes fell over the valley when fog rolled in from the Quantocks. Yet silence, as the monks well knew, is never truly empty. It is merely waiting to be shaped. And so it was that in the autumn of 1936, another seeker arrived, not with instruments or hypotheses, but with grief. Her name was Clara Winthrop, though she signed her letters only as C.W. She was the widow of a minor composer whose symphonies had gone largely unperformed, and whose final work, a choral setting of the Désiré, had been left unfinished at his death 2 years prior. Friends described her as haunted by absence, a woman who moved through rooms as if trailing invisible chords of sound. She came to Somerset not for research, but for reprieve. The manor house, now owned by a distant cousin indifferent to its history, was let cheaply, and its isolation suited her sorrow. She brought with her her husband's manuscripts, his tuning, books, and a small harmonium he had used to test vocal ranges. She intended to complete his final composition, though she admitted in a letter to her sister that the notes refuse to come, they seem already taken. It was during one sleepless night in late October that she first heard it, not from the Abbey, but from within the manor itself. A low sea, sustained and resonant, emanating not from any instrument, but from the very floorboards beneath her bed. She traced the sound to the library, where Thorne's old desk stood beneath a warped window. There, tucked inside a false drawer, she discovered by accident, lay a bundle of wax cylinders, Ashworth's final recordings, never submitted to the Royal Society. With trembling hands, she played them on a borrowed phonograph. What issued forth was not music, but something deeper, intervals held in perfect suspension, silences carved with geometric precision, harmonies that seemed to fold time rather than fill it. She listened for 3 nights straight, taking no food, barely blinking. On the 4th morning, she walked to the Abbey at dawn and placed her husband's unfinished score on the altar stone. Then she sat cross-legged in the nave and began to hum. Witnesses, there were few and none reliable, claimed that mist gathered unnaturally around the ruins that day, coiling through the arches like incense. The village postmaster later recalled seeing Clara return at dusk, her face pale but serene, carrying a single sheet of paper covered in fresh notation. She completed her husband's Dies Irae within the week. The manuscript, now in private hands, contains passages of such harmonic complexity that modern choirs struggle to perform them without dizziness or disorientation. More curiously, every performance reported since has been accompanied by anomalous acoustic effects. Microphones picking up voices not present in the room, singers swearing they heard their own parts sung back to them a fraction of a second before they uttered them. Audiences describing a sensation of being inside a bell. Clara published nothing, gave no interviews. She left Somerset in December, leaving behind only a note pinned to the manor door. They needed a vessel. I offered mine. The outbreak of war soon after buried St. Morwen's once more beneath the urgencies of the age. Soldiers billeted in the manor during the Blitz spoke of hearing chants in the cellar during air raids, though they assumed it was radiostatic or nerves. In 1952, a team from the BBC's Folk Music Archive visited the site while collecting regional ballads. Their field recorder captured nothing unusual until the tapes were reviewed weeks later in London. Beneath the interview with an elderly shepherd, analysts detected a faint, wordless harmony threading through the background noise, perfectly, in tune with the shepherd's off-key whistling, yet clearly not originating from him. The tape was labeled acoustic anomaly, likely interference, and filed away. It was not until the digital age that fragments began to resurface. In 2007, an audio historian restoring Ashworth cylinders isolated a sub-harmonic layer previously undetectable, a sequence of pulses corresponding to the Fibonacci series embedded within the overtone structure. Around the same time, Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the ossuary Miss Vane discovered was not an isolated chamber, but part of a larger network of tunnels radiating outward from the choir, their walls lined with porous limestone arranged in deliberate acoustic arrays. Scholars debated whether this was monastic engineering or natural formation, but none could explain why the tunnels aligned precisely with solstice sunrises and the magnetic declination of 1538. Still, the true nature of St. Morwen's resists classification. It is neither ghost story nor scientific curiosity, but something older, a threshold. Those who linger too long in its shadow often report a subtle shift in perception, not hallucination, but a heightened awareness of silence as a medium, as something that can be shaped, inhabited, even answered. A visiting architect in 1983 claimed the stones leaned inward when no one was looking. A poet in 1999 wrote that the air tastes of vowels. None stayed long. Today, the manor is a private residence again, its current occupants politely discouraging visitors. The Abbey ruins are fenced off, ostensibly for safety, though locals say the gate is always unlocked at twilight. On certain evenings, always damp, always still, if one stands at the crossing where the altar once stood and closes one's eyes, one may hear not a chorus, but a single voice, breath drawn in, held, released in perfect pitch. It does not sing words, but intention, not memory, but presence, and when it fades, the silence that follows is not absence, but continuation, as though the world itself has paused to listen. Sometimes, long after you've left, you'll catch yourself holding your breath in ordinary rooms, waiting for the walls to answer. They never do, but you keep listening anyway. The persistence of St. Morwen's is not in its stones, but in the quiet compulsion it instills in those who encounter it, a compulsion not to speak of it loudly, but to return again and again, as though drawn by an unfinished phrase. In the decades following the poet's fleeting visit, the Abbey became less a destination than a resonance that trailed its witnesses into their ordinary lives. They carried it in the way they paused before answering a question, in how they listened to rain with an intensity bordering on reverence, in the sudden stillness that overtook them when a certain chord was struck on a piano. The phenomenon, if it could be called that, had ceased to be local. It had become psychological, almost viral, an echo that replicated not through sound, but through attention. This subtle contagion found its most unlikely host in 1974, in the person of Dr. Helen Price, a clinical psychologist specializing in auditory hallucinations. She had no interest in folklore or acoustics. Her work concerned the fragile boundary between perception and projection in patients suffering from prolonged isolation. She came to Somerset not for the Abbey, but to study elderly residents of remote farmsteads, many of whom reported hearing voices during winter months. It was during an interview with a retired sexton, then 92, his hands gnarled like rootwood, that she first heard the name St. Morwen spoken without irony or fear. "They don't talk," the old man said, squinting into the peat smoke curling from his pipe. "They listen. And if you're quiet enough, they let you hear what listening sounds like." Intrigued despite herself, Price visited the ruins on a grey November afternoon. She brought no recording devices, only a notebook and a professional skepticism honed by years of distinguishing trauma from transcendence. Yet within minutes of stepping into the nave, she experienced what she later described in her private journal as a collapse of auditory hierarchy. The wind, the distant crow, the rustle of her own coat, these receded, not into silence, but into a kind of background hum, over which a single pure tone emerged, not loud but central, as though her ears had been reoriented around it. She stood motionless for nearly an hour, unaware of time, unaware even of her own breath, until the light shifted and the tone dissolved. That night, she dreamed not of voices but of architecture, walls breathing in unison, arches expanding and contracting like ribs. Her scientific detachment did not shatter, it deepened. Over the next year, she returned monthly, each time documenting not paranormal claims, but measurable shifts in her own perceptual field. She noted that her heart rate slowed upon entering the site, that her alpha brainwave activity, measured later with portable EEG equipment, increased markedly, and that her sense of temporal duration became unreliable. 10 minutes felt like 40, an hour like a moment. Most tellingly, she discovered that if she hummed a specific pitch, G below middle C, the same note Clara Winthrop had described, the ambient resonance of the ruins seemed to lock into alignment, as though her voice had completed a circuit. She began to suspect that the monks had not merely imprinted sound into stone, but engineered a feedback loop between human physiology and architectural form, a sacred technology designed not to summon spirits, but to attune the living to a deeper frequency of awareness. Price never published her findings. Colleagues who saw her notes assumed she had succumbed to suggestion, or perhaps to the melancholic atmosphere of the moors. But in her final entry, dated March 1976, she wrote, "We assume that silence is the absence of sound. But what if it is the presence of something else, something that only reveals itself when we stop filling the world with noise?" The monks didn't leave ghosts. They left a space. And spaces, like vows, can be kept. She resigned her post that spring and moved to a cottage 3 miles from the Abbey, where she lived quietly until her death in 2001. Neighbors said she rarely spoke, but often sat in her garden at dusk, eyes closed, face turned toward the ruins. After her passing, her executors found a locked drawer containing a single cassette tape labeled "For the Listener." When played, it held only 47 minutes of near silence, broken, at the very end, by a single inhalation, slow and deliberate, followed by a chord so soft it might have been imagined. The tape was donated to the British Library's Sound Archive, where it remains catalogued under unidentified ambient recordings, possibly faulty. Meanwhile, the Abbey itself continued its slow surrender to time. Ivy strangled the last freestanding pillar. Frost cracked the remaining flagstones. Rain seeped into the archery tunnels, dissolving mortar into slurry. Yet the reports did not cease. In 1989, a group of university students camping nearby claimed that their digital watches reset to 3:33 a.m. repeatedly throughout the night, a time with no known liturgical significance, though Ashworth's notes mention it as the hour when the harmonic lattice is most receptive. In 2003, a sound artist installed contact microphones on the ruins for an installation titled Litany of Absence. The resulting piece, though composed of ambient vibrations, was withdrawn after multiple listeners reported vivid, shared dreams of robed figures standing in concentric circles, mouths open not to sing, but to breathe in unison. The most recent documented encounter occurred in the winter of 2019. A young archivist from the Diocesan Records Office, tracing the provenance of a mislabeled Cistercian charter, discovered a marginal note in a 16th century ledger. The choir of St. Morwen's gave no voice to the king's commissioners, but the stones sang in their stead. Intrigued, she visited the site on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the same date, she later realized, as the monk's final vigil. She brought only a notebook and a thermos of tea. As dusk fell, she sat on the altar base, watching her breath curl in the cold air. And then, just as the last light bled from the sky, she heard it, not from the ruins, but from within her own chest, a vibration low and steady, as though her ribs had become part of the choir. She did not speak of it publicly, but in a private letter to a colleague she wrote, "I understand now. They didn't bind their voices to the stone. They bound their silence, and silence properly kept outlasts empires. Today, St. Morwen stands as it always has, half ruin, half reliquary. Tourists pass by on country walks, snapping photographs of arches against the sky, unaware that the true relic is not what is seen, but what is withheld. The gate remains unlocked at twilight, though fewer dare to enter. Those who do rarely speak of what they experience. They return home changed not by terror, but by a quiet recalibration, a new sensitivity to the spaces between sounds, to the weight of a held breath, to the way silence can gather like water in a cupped hand. And if you should ever find yourself standing alone in that nave as mist rises from the earth, do not listen for voices. Listen for the pause before the note. For it is there, in that suspended instant, fragile as a spider's thread, that the monks still keep their vow. Not to be remembered, but to remain. Not to sing, but to hold the silence so perfectly that, for a moment, the world forgets to make noise. And in that hush, you may feel it, the gentle pressure of centuries leaning in, not to speak, but to hear you breathe. The true measure of St. Morwen's endurance lies not in the persistence of its phenomena, but in the quiet transformations it effects in those who encounter it. Transformations so subtle they are often mistaken for coincidence or melancholy or the natural wear of time. By the early 21st century, the Abbey had ceased to be a subject of scholarly inquiry or even local superstition. It had become something far more potent, a threshold that existed not only in the moors of Somerset, but in the inner landscape of memory itself. Those who had stood within its ruins carried it with them, not as a story to tell, but as a silence to keep. And in an age of ceaseless noise, of digital chatter, of engines and alerts and the hum of screens, the silence of St. Morwen's became not an absence, but a refuge. This quiet magnetism drew its next witness, not through curiosity but through exhaustion. In 2023, a man named Daniel Reeve, formerly a sound engineer for major orchestras, now retired due to tinnitus so severe he could no longer distinguish pitch from pain, arrived in the village under an assumed name, seeking only quiet. He had spent his life shaping sound, amplifying it, isolating its components, only to find himself haunted by phantom tones that no instrument had ever played. Doctors called it neurological. He called it betrayal. He rented a cottage on the edge of the manor grounds, intending to spend his days reading and his nights in darkness, away from the tyranny of vibration. But silence, he soon discovered, was not the same as stillness. The tinnitus did not abate. It merely changed character. In London, it had been a shrill, metallic whine. Here, in the damp hush of the moors, it softened into something almost harmonic, a low drone that seemed to pulse in time with his own breath. One evening, unable to sleep, he walked toward the Abbey, not out of hope but out of habit, the old engineer's instinct to locate the source of a sound. He carried no equipment, only a walking stick, and the weight of years spent listening for errors in perfect performances. What he found was not error, but resolution. As he stepped through the broken west arch, the phantom tone in his ears did not vanish. It aligned. It dropped a semitone, then another, until it settled into a perfect fifth below the ambient hum of the night. For the first time in years, the noise inside his head was not an intrusion, but part of a chord. He sank to his knees on the cold stone, tears tracing paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He did not hear singing. He heard consonants. Over the following weeks, Reeve returned nightly, not to record or analyze, but simply to be present. He began to notice patterns, the way mist collected in the transept like breath held too long, how the temperature dropped precisely at the spot where the choir once stood, even on mild nights, how the stars above seemed to dim slightly when the air grew thick with that familiar, wordless resonance. He realized that his tinnitus was not being silenced, it was being tuned. The Abbey was not healing him. It was incorporating him, in a gesture both scientific and sacramental. He placed small quartz crystals, known for their piezoelectric properties, at key points around the nave. Connected by fine copper wire to a rudimentary oscilloscope he'd assembled from spare parts. The readings were astonishing. The crystals registered micro-vibrations even in dead calm, vibrations that followed cyclical patterns corresponding not to weather or seismic activity, but to the medieval liturgical calendar. On the Feast of the Transfiguration, the waveform spiked into a complex harmonic. On ember days, it flattened into near stillness. The stones were not echoing the past, they were enacting it. Reeve never published his data. Instead, he began to compose, not with notes on a staff, but with breath, with posture, with presence. He would stand at the crossing at dawn, inhale slowly, and exhale on a single pitch, watching as the oscilloscope traced the interaction between his voice and the ambient field. The resulting waveforms were not chaotic, but symbiotic, his breath weaving into the stone's memory like thread into cloth. He came to understand that the monks had not sought immortality through song, but continuity through resonance. They had turned their bodies into instruments, and their vows into frequencies, and in doing so, had made the Abbey a living tuning fork, one that still hummed with the intention of its makers. His health did not improve in any clinical sense. His ears still rang, but the ringing no longer tormented him. It accompanied him, like a companion who spoke only in harmonics. In his final journal entry, found after his body was discovered seated upright against the east wall in November 2024, eyes closed, hands resting on his knees, he wrote, "I came seeking silence. I found a conversation. They do not sing to be heard. They sing to keep the world from falling out of tune." His death was ruled natural, though the coroner noted an unusual absence of rigor mortis, as though his muscles had relaxed into the stone itself. The oscilloscope was missing. The quartz crystals remained, arranged in a perfect circle around the altar base. Since then, the Abbey has grown quieter still, not because the phenomenon has faded, but because fewer now come seeking proof. The age of documentation has given way to the age of discretion. Those who know do not speak. They listen, and in the rare moments when someone does stand alone in the nave at twilight, they do not expect a revelation. They expect a resonance. They offer their breath, and if the air is right, the stones answer, not with voices, but with a deepening of silence so profound it feels like grace. It is said that on the longest night of the year, if snow lies lightly on the ruins and the moon is new, the entire valley falls into a hush so complete that even the owls cease their calling. In that stillness, those who have kept the silence of St. Morwen's report a final, fleeting sensation, not sound, not vision, but the unmistakable feeling of being gently held, not by hands, but by harmony. And when they return to their lives, they carry that feeling like a secret chord, played only in the quietest chambers of the heart. For the true legacy of the choir that sang without voices is not that they defied death, but that they taught the living how to listen beyond sound, to hear the devotion in a held breath, the faith in a silent stone, the eternal in the echo between one heartbeat and the next. And so the Abbey waits, not for believers, but for listeners. For in the end, all sacred spaces are not built to be seen, but to be heard, and in the deepest silence, even stone remembers how to pray.